All right, I think we're gold.
All right, so thank you all for coming. This is a never thought of event in the history of Newman Club to have a well-known Catholic author from Austria with us today over Zoom, because no one ever thought of COVID in the first place. So anyway, COVID kind of allowed things to happen. So we're here to talk about a modern couple, a modern imperial couple who I would say are very underrated, although their cultus is slowly gaining prominence and they're beginning to be prayed to and venerated amongst certain Catholic circles. And that couple is Blessed Charles of Austria and his wife, Servant of God Zita of Bourbon Parma. And with us here today is Mr. Charles Coulombe to talk about them. And he is a well-known Catholic author and historian. And he is well-versed in the lore surrounding Blessed Charles of Austria, as well as in general Catholic history, traditions, and also the Catholic monarchy, as well as he has written many books, one of them being Vicars of Christ, and the other, the most recent book on Blessed Charles of Austria, which is not showing up because of my background. There we go. Blessed Charles of Austria. So without further ado, please, Mr. Charles Coulombe, take it away.
Well, thanks very, very much indeed, Michael. And thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. I am here in beautiful Tumblar, Austria, south of Vienna, not too far from where Emperor Karl spent the war years. Well, some of them anyway, the last couple, in his headquarters at the city of Baden. The title of the talk this evening is Blessed Charles and Servant of God Zita, a modern couple. That sounds very strange, actually, if you think about it, because none of us know a great many emperors and empresses. We probably know very few people in civic life who take their Catholic faith seriously, as other than perhaps a vote-getting device. Add to that, this is a couple who had 8 children, and that is not that common today, at least not in the Western world. So at first sight, you might say to yourself, what's so modern about these guys? Especially because they lived, well, almost 100 years ago. In the case of Karl, he died, and Zita died in 1989, which for me is yesterday, but for many of, I know many of my viewers, it's ancient history. So where to start? And I suppose the answer is that we can look to Karl and Zita for several very, very important things. The first is what the nature of duty, devotion, and honor are. And these are particularly unmodern conceptions, but they are perennial. Then you've got to bear in mind that modern, whatever it might be called, passes by very, very quickly. 2 years after Blessed Charles died, the Charleston was invented. And for the rest of the 1920s, it was the most modern thing. And now it's a real museum piece, because nothing ages more pathetically, more sadly, than the latest thing. It's eternal principles that last forever. It's perennial things that continue on and on and on. What we see in Karl and Zita are a couple who managed, despite the uproar and the horrors of the modernity that they lived through, they nevertheless managed to hold on to what was true and real without ever losing either their sense of charity or, to be honest with you, their sense of humor. So let's look at the couple separately for a moment. They were related distantly. Look at Zita first, ladies first, they used to say when I was a kid. Empress Zita came from an interesting family. On her father's side, she was a Bourbon Parma. And her father had 2 wives, and between them, almost 20 children, if not 21. She had a lot of kids between the two. She had a lot of full siblings, a lot of half siblings. Her father had been the Duke of Parma, was driven into exile by the Sardinians in 1859. And this theme of exile was very, very big in her family because he wasn't simply the exiled Duke of Parma. He was a close relation of the exiled Carlist kings of Spain and of the exiled King of France, the Comte de Chambord, who, in fact, was so close to him, he left him his big chateau, Chambord, in France. If that weren't enough exile background, her mother was the daughter of the losing heir of the Portuguese Civil War in the 1830s. He was the rightful king. He was defeated by his younger brother, and they went into exile in Austria. So you have in her background a great deal of loss mingled with, how do I put it, keeping a stiff upper lip, not giving in, not collapsing, not seeing the loss of everything you know and love as an excuse for giving up the ghost. She was going to need every bit of that. Karl, on the other hand, his wife's family was happy, his was not. His mother and father, the Archduke Otto and the Archduchess Maria Josefa, were not really well suited for each other, to put it mildly. His mother was very devout, very pious, but kind of dour. His father was charming, amusing, the life of the party, very good looking, and, well, let's just say he died of syphilis. So as you can imagine, this was a couple that had problems fairly early on. And yet, Karl, apart from being, as we'll touch on momentarily, a tremendous husband and father, was also a remarkable thing. He was a very good son, a son to two difficult parents, a good son, a loyal son. He got on very well with both of them, which took some doing, especially after they stopped living in the same place. Beyond that, he got the best out of each of them. From his mother, he got that piety I mentioned, that deep, deep devotion, and it never left him, not to the end. But from his father, he got the joie de vivre, the sense of humor, the charm, all that sort of thing, without the promiscuity. And he seamlessly united these two sets of good traits into a very winning persona. Now, he had an uncle. His great uncle was the Emperor Franz Joseph, the heir to the throne, or sorry, the Kaiser rather, the Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, who himself had a very tragic life. His brother, the Emperor Maximilian, was shot in Mexico. His son, Archduke Rudolf, had either killed himself or was murdered in a mysterious event at a place called Meyerling. I've often called it the Kennedy assassination of the 19th century. And to this day, there's all sorts of questions about what really happened. And then his wife was assassinated in 1898. So he had one tragedy after another, but he just kept on and on and on, decade after decade. And to this day, not just in Vienna, but in Budapest, in Prague, in Bratislava, in Zagreb, in Ljubljana, all over the old empire, you'll still see photographs and statues and pictures and paintings of Franz Joseph. Like Queen Victoria, he came to define a whole era for his peoples. And he ruled from 1848 to 1916. So it was around quite a while. His heir was Karl's uncle, Franz Ferdinand, who most people remember best. Most people remember best as the assassination victim at Sarajevo. But he was a lot more than that. Franz Ferdinand is an important figure to know about when you're studying Emperor Karl, because in many ways he provided his nephew an example and a lot of practical guidance. He married morganatically, very much against his uncle Franz Josef's disapproval. And what to marry morganatically means is to marry beneath your station so that your children do not have rights. This is why Karl was the heir to the throne and not Franz Ferdinand's children. This in itself could have been a source of resentment or rancor. No such story. The uncle loved his nephew, despite the fact that the nephew was in the position that he might have expected his children to have. And in later years, the nephew would take care of the children, the Hohenberg children, as they were called. Well, Franz Ferdinand had married morganatically, but he married for love. And he was very devout himself, incidentally, and so was his wife, who was born the Countess Sophie Kotek, and became, after her marriage to Franz Ferdinand, the Duchess of Hohenberg. They were a very devout couple, but they were very happy, very domestic, had quite a number of children. And when single and when married, Karl enjoyed visiting with them because it was about the only happy home life there was to be seen. But more than that, Franz Ferdinand also had a very political vision. And this is an extremely important thing to bear in mind. His political vision was twofold. One, he wanted to see Austria-Hungary federalized. That is to say, he wanted to see the different peoples of the empire reorganized on the basis of equality amongst each other. And this earned him some enemies internally. But it did make him very popular among the South Slavs, the Croats, the Slovenes, and the Serbians in the empire, which in its way paved the way for his death. That was internal. Externally, Austria-Hungary was allied to Germany, and in Franz Ferdinand's view, too tightly, to the point of being dependent. He looked forward to broadening Austria-Hungary's foreign alliances when he should become emperor, with Russia, with Britain, to lessen their complete dependence on the Germans. Now, Karl came to share his uncle's views. And after he married Zita, who was, as we've said, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, very Western-oriented lady, his pre-existing fondness for Western Europe could only grow. And in marrying her, and they married for love, in marrying her, he met a woman who was as dedicated to the ideals he held as he was. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is an extremely important thing for any couple, to have the same visions of life, to believe in the same things. Now, of course, it's also important that they like the same things, be amused by the same things, etc. That's good too. But they have to share the same basic first principles. And Karl and Zita certainly did. After they got married, Karl said to his new wife, "Now we must begin to help each other get to heaven," because they saw marriage as a sacrament. And it's interesting that many years later, when in the 50s, when Karl performed his first miracle, it was on a Brazilian nun whose name was Sister Mary Zita. And when the Empress found that out, she said, "Well, once again, he's thinking of me," which, who knows, may very well be true. I don't know. But what is certain is that they married for life, and they married each other's sense of duty, sense of faith. So there it was. They spent a very pleasant first few years. In 1912, they had their first son, the Archduke Otto. He had taken up a military career. He was in a cavalry unit in Bohemia. And there are a lot of stories about them there, of the various favors they would do for people who didn't know who they were, and that kind of thing. But time moved on, and in 1914, as we know, Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. The Austrians demanded that the Serbs allow them to investigate. This would have been a bit difficult, of course, because the mastermind of the assassination was the head of the Serbian secret police. And a fellow, I can never remember his actual name, but his code name was Apis, A-P-I-S. If you look up Sarajevo and Apis in Google, you'll have his name straight away. So when the war began, Kaiser Franz Josef used Karl as a sort of personal set of eyes and ears. Now, mind you, he commanded troops on the front, but he would also go from one front to another to survey conditions for his uncle, or his great uncle, I should say. And he very often took Zita along, not to the front, but on various trips. There's a very interesting story of how, when they went to Transylvania, they went to a military hospital. Romania had gotten into the war against Austria and had not done very well. And so there were a number of Romanian officers who were POWs in a hospital and wounded. So she went in to visit them with Karl when they were in that city. And she amazed them because of her being able to speak perfect Romanian. And that was the thing, you see, about both Karl and Zita. They were very good with languages. And he was a brilliant man, but she was a brilliant woman. There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it. So what should happen? But that in 1916, he dies. Franz Josef, I mean. He dies, and Karl becomes Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. And he inherits a war he had not started, a country that was not yet on the verge of collapse, but the writing was on the wall. He had an ally who wouldn't listen to him. He warned the Kaiser, and more importantly, the Kaiser's generals, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, that unrestricted submarine warfare would bring the United States into the war. They didn't care. He said, if the United States come into the war, we're not going to win. They didn't believe him, but he was right. And he was right again and again and again, both on the conduct of the war and the conduct of politics. Unfortunately, older and supposedly wiser heads very often prevailed. He was so anxious to end the war that he opened up direct negotiations with the French via his brothers-in-law. Two of Empress Zita's brothers were in the Belgian army, Felix and Xavier and Sixtus of Bourbon Parma. And they acted as direct go-betweens between the French government and Kaiser Karl. It was all very, very cloak and dagger. And the problem he faced was that when the Allies were losing a bit, then they were interested in peace, but no other time. And contrariwise, when the Germans would begin to win, they were not interested in peace. The only alternative would perhaps have been a separate peace. But that he wouldn't do because he considered it dishonorable. He did other things, though. He forbade the use of poison gas. He forbade the use of submarines against unarmed neutral ships. He did everything he could to mitigate the war. And he did something else for which the Italians should be very grateful to him. In 1917, they came up with, or 16, 17, the Germans came up with the bright idea of destabilizing Russia and Italy by smuggling revolutionaries into those countries. In the case of Italy, to destabilize them. In the case of Italy, they would have had to have gone through Austria. And Karl said, no, you're not doing that. He wasn't happy with the Italians because they had been allied to Austria and Germany before World War I, and their coming into the war on the Allied side was considered a betrayal. But betrayal or not, he believed that the communists might damage Italy all right, but they'd end up damaging everyone else as well. He felt the same way about the bright idea of smuggling Lenin into Russia. He forbade the use of Austrian territory for it, so they did not go through Galicia, which was intended, and the Germans had to send him directly to Petrograd. But he warned the Kaiser and his two generals, who by this time really ran the show, he warned them that the communist revolution in Russia would A, be horrible to the Russians, and B, would eventually reverberate in Germany and Austria. And he was, of course, quite correct. He knew what he was talking about once again, but it didn't matter. Well, in the meantime, the Allied blockade was extremely tight. And by this time, now we're in 1918, the peoples of Austria-Hungary were beginning to really feel it, to really starve. Eventually, our own president, Woodrow Wilson, I say our in the larger sense. I know you Canadians, Hungarians, and others listening to him have nothing to do with him. You Canadians have Lloyd George, though, so yes, in those days before the Statute of Westminster, Lloyd George was yours, not ours. Anyway, the sad truth of the matter is that it was American insistence on the overthrow of the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns that led to their overthrow, because they basically told the defeated peoples, you get rid of them, or we don't end the blockade and you get to starve. It really was that simple. So I won't go into the details as to what happened in Austria, except to say that it broke up very quickly. The emperor had allowed, remember what I said about Franz Ferdinand wanting to federalize the empire, and Karl had also. He figured that might well save it. And perhaps it would have had Wilson not been Woodrow Wilson. So the various countries declared independence, federated with other places, and so forth. And in the end, Karl had to go into exile in Switzerland. And he did, with his wife and children. In 1919 and 1920, he watched from Switzerland the terrible things that were going on in his former countries. The communist regime that came and went in Hungary, leaving an incredible swath of devastation in its place. Bela Kun was the name of the dictator. He was, however, overthrown by a coalition of monarchists and others who were headed by a man who had formerly been Kaiser Karl's adjutant and sworn undying loyalty to him, the former admiral of the fleet, Admiral Horthy, the sailor on horseback, who led his troops into Budapest in 1920 and drove out, with the help of the Romanians, the infamous Bela Kun. So, Hungary now once more had a government that was allegedly friendly to the House of Habsburg. Admiral Horthy was regent. He made it clear in a number of letters to Karl that he intended to restore him as King of Hungary. Well, time went by, and the reports he began to get from Hungary, Karl that is, were not very good, not at all. So he tried an interesting method almost a little over 100 years ago last month. He attempted to retake the throne all by himself with the help of a couple of friends, trusting that Horthy meant what he said. So he went back to Hungary, went to Budapest, saw Horthy. Horthy had no intention of giving up control. The thing I should point out also is that the French Prime Minister, Briand, was at that time very keen on seeing a Habsburg restoration in Hungary. There were a couple of reasons for that. One, he had been on the other side during the peace negotiations during the war, and he knew that Karl was a decent man. Secondly, he was fearful of Italian and eventually revivified German influence in Central Europe and the power vacuum that was there. So he told Karl the first time that he tried it, if you succeed, we'll back you up, we'll tell your neighbors to leave you alone, and we'll give you all sorts of financial credits, which Hungary really needed at that time. Well, all of that was wasted on Horthy. And as Briand had promised, and having failed to get Horthy to give up control, Briand denied any knowledge of it, and the Allied powers demanded that he be sent back. And so he was. He went back to Switzerland, was put in another part of the country with his family. But he and his wife planned yet another attempt, and this time it would be militant. Well, they tried in October of 1921. The Empress was pregnant at that time, but she flew back with her husband. It was the first time I think either of them had ever flown. And they flew to Western Hungary. They raised the flag, they gathered the troops, and they went by rail almost all the way to Budapest. Again, I won't go into the details. I've written about them elsewhere, but suffice to say, there was yet another round of betrayal, and the whole plot came to nothing in the end. As a result, the Allies were fearful that as long as the Habsburgs were on, this couple were on the continent of Europe, they might come back. So they decided to exile them. From Hungary, they were put on a boat in the Danube, which took them to the Black Sea, which put them on a British warship, which took them to the island of Madeira. Now, at that point, the Allies insisted that Karl and Zita renounce their thrones and their rights, and they both refused to do so. So to pay them back, they were not allowed to receive money from outside. So when they got to Madeira, they had next to nothing. Fortunately, in a sense, a local businessman offered them the use of his summer house. The summer houses are nice places in the summer. In the autumn and the winter, especially in the mountains of Madeira, they're not so nice. Cold and foggy. Perhaps if they'd had more money, if they could have afforded decent food, decent medicine, his resistance would have been stronger. Who knows? But he caught a lung inflammation, and over many weeks, he finally died after all sorts of unpleasant treatments, cupping and things like that. All through that death, he was very loving to his wife and to his children. And when he finally came to die, having shown every evidence of piety on the way, receiving communion as often as he could, praying and all that, he did several things which were quite remarkable. On the one hand, he told his wife, I am suffering that my peoples might come back together. And to me, that's kind of amazing, because I think if I were in his position, I would hate whoever had put me in that position. He didn't. He then said something very strange to Empress Zita. He said, when I'm gone, I want you to contact the King of Spain. I've just spoken to him. He'll take care of you. Well, she was, how could you possibly have done that? He said, don't worry about it. Just do as I say. You'll see. Well, the last word he said was Jesus. It was a very, very touching death. You can read about it at great length at various places. But he died, and he was entombed in the the church there in Funchal. And then King Alfonso XIII of Spain, she managed to get in touch with him, and he sent a cruiser to pick them up. And the British were incensed. They were furious. They said, no, you can't take her unless she renounces the throne for herself and her children. And the King of Spain said, no, I'm sending a ship. And if you fire on it, you're at war with Spain. Now, that might not have seemed like a great threat, but I assure you in 1922, Britain was not in a position to go to war with anybody, as she showed when she backed down from a standoff in Turkey. So the Spanish ship came, picked them up, took them back to Spain. They took the train to Madrid. And then she talked to the king and was curious as to why he had done this. And he said, well, you know, it's the strangest thing, but the day they told me your husband had died, I suddenly had this bizarre feeling that if I didn't look after you, the same thing would happen to my wife and children. So then she told him what her husband had said, and they rolled their eyes at each other. So at any rate, Zita was now there, pregnant. She had their last child, number 8, Archduchess Elizabeth. And they lived for the next few years in the north coast of Spain. Eventually, in 1930, moving to Belgium. Now, they had a lot of adventures, she and the children. And what is remarkable about her during this period is how her whole interest was keeping up the name and the position that her husband had left her. In a lot of ways, she had to be both father and mother for her children. And as anyone who's done that can tell you, it's not easy. Very modern, but not easy. But she did a very good job. She arranged for an extraordinary education for all of them. In 1940, they fled to Canada and spent the war years in Quebec City. Not Otto, he was in Washington and around the United States, advising President Roosevelt on Austrian affairs. In fact, it's very much due to Archduke Otto that Austria was considered a victim nation and not an Axis country. So even though they were divided into zones of occupation after the war, they were not obliterated. And they regained their independence in 1955, which wouldn't happen for Germany until 89. So at any rate, so Zita saw her children raised, and then she went into an almost monastic setting, a life of prayer in Switzerland. But she did travel. It's interesting that when she went to see Pope John Paul II, he said, "It is a great honor to at last meet my father's empress." And what's interesting about that is that Karl Wojtyła was named after Kaiser Karl. His father was a very, very loyal Polish subject of the emperor. So that was a very, very touching moment. What's interesting too is that Pope John Paul II beatified the man after whom he was named. You might say he created his own patron saint. I think that's probably the only time in history that's ever happened. But Zita, in turn, kept the flag flying to the end of her days. She was an amazing woman. I never met her. I knew her son, the Archduke Otto. I never met her. But by all accounts, she combined an enormous amount of femininity and piety with an iron will and determination. And that's not a bad combination, especially when you're in the position she was in. Unfortunately, as all people must, she died in 1989. And they had a huge state funeral for her. And within months, the Iron Curtain began to collapse. I've always wondered whether or not It was due partly to her intercession. Once she went, the whole thing began to erode very quickly. So, what are we left with in looking at them? We're left with a couple who are devoted to each other, to their goals, their ideals. We're left with a couple who are devoted to their children and continued to have them, despite the difficulties they lived through. Their 4 youngest children were all born in exile. You know, very often people will say, well, how could you possibly bring children into a world this awful? Well, you have to. It's the way our ancestors did it after the Black Death. That's why we're here. If you think about it, we all descend from people who looked around a landscape that was utterly wrecked and believed sufficiently in the future to have children anyway. And they did. And they put their children's welfare above their own. Also a very important concept. Beyond that, as rulers, they were willing to give up everything for their people. They looked at their people the way they looked at their children, as worth sacrificing themselves for. And that, you know, ladies and gentlemen, is a kind of leadership we're not really familiar with today, if you look at the sorts of creatures who are allowed to vote for. You in Canada, of course, you do have the Queen, who perhaps has a touch of the same spirit. In the United States, we don't have anyone like that. Not a soul. Which perhaps is why his cause is so popular in the United States. There are now 17 shrines to Kaiser Karl from the Pacific to the Atlantic. It's really quite amazing if you think about it, considering that normally we're not very fond of countries that we've defeated in wartime. We try not to think about countries that beat us, so don't you go bringing up the War of 1812. It's the reason why most of us have never heard of it. But seriously, they were a most remarkable couple, a couple for our time, not because they exemplify what we have, but precisely because they are what we need. Their qualities are what we need in parents, in children, in spouses, in leadership, in the military. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his justice, and all this shall be added unto you. They themselves certainly believed that. They had a joint devotion to the Eucharist, to the Sacred Heart, to the Virgin Mary. The family rosary was a big thing with them, family consecration to the Sacred Heart. I mean, I could go on and on and on about their internal prayer life. But so it has a lot to tell us in the different spheres in which we live. I think possibly the biggest thing that we should take away from them, is that to the degree that we're able to emulate them, to that degree, this modern couple will help make this modern world a lot better and the future a lot brighter. They never ceased to plan for the future. They never ceased to adjust to the present as they had to. It's something that faces us all, but they never, ever, ever lost sight of their ideals. They never lost sight of what was important. And in that sense, ladies and gentlemen, in that sense, their example, I think, will never be irrelevant. It'll never be irrelevant as long as we live in a society that is based upon the principles that they opposed, and which all decent people should. So, with that, I have come to the end of my time, and I am ready for questions and/or answers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coulombe. We do have some pre-submitted questions, and thank you very much for that talk. It was very inspiring. So now getting into our pre-submitted questions, and what we'll do is we'll go through these two questions, and then we'll open up the floor to anybody that has a question. If you do, please indicate so in the chat and we'll call on you, or if you don't feel comfortable speaking out, then you can write it out and we will read it out for you. So the first question that was submitted was, what's the best way to live a holy life whilst courting or not yet being married?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, there are books that have been written about that. But I would say three things come to mind. And I mean, as I say, there are really, really good books that should be read. Clean Love and Courtship is the title that comes to mind. But never put yourself in a position of temptation. The select entertainments that are uplifting and enjoyable for you both, and public. And well, let me see. There should be a third point. Oh, well, yeah. Try to socialize to the degree that you can. Do try to socialize with their families. And this goes for both sides. I'll tell you why. You really, if you're presuming you intend to marry this person, you really, really need to know what their family dynamic is like, because that's all they know about being a husband or a wife. So in a sense, you need to know what they know. And the best way to do that is to socialize with the family. Also, it'll give them a chance to, look you over.
Okay, and then the second question here, and if anybody has any questions, okay, I see we've got one pending there, so we'll get around to that. The second question, are there any statues, places, days, etc. dedicated to Blessed Charles worldwide?
Oh, yes. You want to go to the Gebetsliga's website, emperorcharles.org. They have, golly, busts, pictures, icons, a prayer book, which have second. I am not getting any money out of this, so you see, it's a plug, but I'm not getting any dough. This is the Gebetsliga's English language prayer book. It's really quite a good one, quite amazing, and I recommend it very highly. So emperorcharles.org will clue you into all that sort of thing, and also keep you abreast of Caroline events going on. Now, as far as dates go, it's an interesting thing. Speaking of there being a couple for the modern era, his feast day is October 21st, but that's not his death day. It's the day he was married. And I was at the beatification in Rome, and I knew when that was announced as the date that Zita that her cause would be introduced, because it was obvious to me that eventually the two of them will both be beatified, God willing, both be canonized, and then they'll have a joint feast day the day of their marriage. So this is an important message from them, with them. April 1st, April Fool's Day, is actually the day of his death. And so as a result, it's become kind of a secondary observance. Also, we are approaching next year the centennial of his death, 1922, April the 1st. Already there have begun to be centennial observances in different places. In Rome, the Archduke Edward von Habsburg, the Hungarian ambassador to the Holy See, gave led a rosary and gave a lecture online. I think you can see it online. There was a big a week-long mass and prayer service thing in Budapest at the Basilica of St. Stephen in his honor. And presumably, despite dearest anti-COVID, presumably these things will increase in various places until the actual day, April 1st, 2022, which will be his centennial.
All right, Father Horgan, feel free to go ahead.
Very good. Thank you, Charles, for a wonderful presentation. For the sake of our Vancouver listeners who may not know it, we have a shrine of Blessed Karl here in Vancouver. I designed a stained glass window at St. Peter and Paul Parish, which was blessed and dedicated in 2006. And in that window, which is a part of a Beatitudes series, Karl appears in the image, "Blessed are the pure in heart," as a model for Catholic husbands and fathers. And so in the image, he's shown wearing his brown suit from the exile, holding a bouquet of flowers for Zita in one hand, and in his other, he holds a locket in which Zita's image is painted. So I think it's probably the only stained glass window that's been done of Karl, to my knowledge, and also the only one in which they appear jointly in a church. And in 2010, we had the happiness of a visit from Archduke Rudolph, his grandson, and his wife, Archduchess Sophie. And 2 years later, he returned for another visit with their son, Joseph, who was considering a religious vocation at the time. And so that's my question for you, Charles, is could you speak about the role of Karl and Zita's children? As I understood it, she wanted them to live in the various countries of the former empire and to be of public service. But a number, particularly of Rudolph and Sophie's children, have found religious vocations. And I was wondering if you could comment on that and tell our hearers about it.
Well, it's very true. Actually, down through the years, there is one other, I think she's a venerable, another Habsburg nun from the 16th century, who's a Habsburg Archduchess, who became a nun, who's now a venerable. But there have been quite a few Habsburgs who went into religious life at different times. Now we have, I think, 4 or 5. The oldest son of Karl and Zita, the Archduke Otto, was trained to be Emperor of Austria and king of the other countries. Of course, as we know, he didn't get the chance. I always call him the greatest emperor they never had, because he was a brilliant man. As I say, I knew him. I corresponded with him from the time I was in high school, and I met him twice. He was a great man. He was a great believer in European unity. And here I have to make a point, because people often get confused on this issue. They look at the European Union as it is today, and seeing the anti-Christian, anti-Catholic horror it's become, immediately discount it and all its works and pomps. But that's a little bit like looking at Justin Trudeau and thinking that Sir John A. Macdonald was the same. No. The fathers of Confederation were not very much like the creatures in Ottawa today. I'm sorry to break the news. Any more than the founding fathers of the United States were like the creatures that run the show there today. That's important to realize when you look at the European Union, because it's gone in directions very different from what its founders, let alone the Archduke, were interested in. Now, the Habsburgs have always had sort of a pan-European mission. Charles V, he was Holy Roman Emperor in the 1500s. They used to say he was the first man on whose empire the sun never set. They're Burgundian, they're Lorrainer, they're this, they're that. As I say, Karl's wife was as Western European as you're going to get. So European unity, one way or another, one form or another, has always been something that has been more or less on the Habsburg agenda. The Archduke Otto saw the way to achieve it in his time as being what was becoming the European Union. Now, that seems strange to us when we look at the final product, but you've got to remember that the initial founders of the EU were most of them were very good Catholics. A couple of them, like Robert Schumann and Alcide de Gasperi, have been considered for beatification themselves, which you couldn't say about either the founding fathers of the states or the fathers of Confederation in Canada. So having said that, his support of the European Union is not as surprising or bizarre as it seems. It was simply his attempting to do something with the tools he had at hand. But of course, things didn't work out the way he would have liked, any more than they did for his parents. Nevertheless, his sons, Karl and Georg, are very active in political affairs. Karl in Austria, Georg in Hungary. He's just been appointed the Hungarian ambassador to Paris. Their Hungarian cousins are also active in Hungary. The Archduke Michael is the head of the Beatification Committee for Cardinal Mindszenty. His son, the Archduke Edward, is, as I say, the ambassador of the Holy See for Hungary. And a lot more Habsburgs doing a lot of amazing stuff. They're a very hardworking bunch, all in all. So as we look at the future, as we look at the fact that whatever is left of what were considered European values and traditions are today primarily to be found in Central Europe, it would be hard to believe that the Habsburg tradition doesn't have a role to play in the future. What that role may be, we have yet to see, but I'm sure we'll find out.
Okay, we'll put out a final call for any questions if anybody wanted to ask anything. It's a wonderful opportunity. There's a question from Brian. What do you think about Jacobitism and the so-called Glorious Revolution?
I'm for the first and against the second. How's that? Fair enough? No, and again, one thing we didn't touch on, but Jacobitism was perhaps the first encounter of legitimist monarchy, the so-called the English Civil War predating the so-called Glorious Revolution. Was the first shock of arms between traditional monarchy and the modern state, or what would become the modern state. And the Empress Zita's family were all bound up with similar struggles in France and Portugal and Spain and Italy. And all of that, that principle of legitimacy, of sacrificial leadership, is a very important one. And it's interesting too, if you look at the English Charles I, who lost his head to Cromwell, and for that matter, his son, James II, you see a lot in common with our Charles I. And one other interesting point I'll make there, Bonnie Prince Charlie, who led the 45, went all the way down to Derby in England. He did not deal very well with defeat the way our Blessed Charles did. But they did have one area where they resembled one another. And that was that they very often had a better idea of what ought to be done than older and wiser heads. With Karl, this was definitely the case in Budapest in 1921, when Colonel Lehar, his right-hand man and an officer as loyal as the day was long, insisted, because the other fellow was the superior officer, on that superior officer having the honor of commanding the emperor's forces. The emperor didn't trust the guy, didn't like him, but he went along with Lehar. It was a huge mistake. Not Lehar's fault in the sense of his intending it, but his superior officer was a traitor. Well, so too with Bonnie Prince Charlie at Derby. There's a very good chance that had they had his lieutenants who overruled him for the, one can only say, prudent reasons, if they'd done as he told them, they would have made it to London. What would have happened then? Who knows? Celebrating birthday of Charles IV as Hungarian king in Budapest every year on 17 August. So there you go. There's thank you very much, Mr. Tot. August 17th is, of course, Karl's birthday. So there you go. You've got April 1st, August 17th, October 21st. Death, birth, marriage, all waiting for you to celebrate.
Michael, I see your hand is raised.
Indeed it is. So, Mr. Coulombe, I remember learning Socials 11. Like, if I have to be honest, the way that World War I is taught is very biased towards, the Allies, Britain, France, and therefore Canada.
Mhm.
So I remember, not learning about Emperor Charles until I did my own research at home, and learned
Yeah.
that he was the actual last emperor of Austria, not Franz Joseph. And whatever I read of him from online sources and whatnot, they say that he was very incompetent. And from reading your book, it shows that he was actually non-competent, but more of his hands were bound behind his back, so he couldn't do much. So, how would you answer the charges of incompetency on Emperor Charles's part?
Well, it's very simple, really. Study it. I mean, the truth of the matter is that he inherited a situation which was horrific. He was betrayed at least 4 times by major figures. I'll tick them off for you. Count Czernin, the foreign minister, Karl Renner, the later Chancellor of Austria, who managed to betray his country 3 times. After betraying his emperor, he collaborated with the Nazis and then with Stalin. So, see, that was a guy who knew where to keep his bread buttered on. The third was, of course, Admiral Horthy. And the fourth, well, maybe there were just 3, but those 3 come to mind. And it is from those men and the people allied to them that most of our modern historiography has come. Because, as you know, the winners write the histories. However, there has been a revolution in Habsburg historiography in the past decade, even less. A lot of new books coming out. Peter Judson's New History of the Habsburg Empire, Richard Bassett's Forgotten Kaiser on the New History of the Imperial Army. And all of these things are being cast in a very different light from the way the victors of World War I needed them to be cast, and the way the successors of those who stole power from the Habsburgs needed them to be cast. If you look at Karl's personal bravery, he was an amazing man. But before he was emperor, when he had a command on the Tyrolean front with Italy, there was a flash flood. And it so happened that there was a sort of lame soldier who'd been wounded. So he wasn't really good for much except to watch the horses. Flood comes along, grabs the guy off into it. And the General Archduke, as he was then, jumped into the water at great risk to his own life and rescued him. His soldiers loved him. And of course, they knew best. He shared their hardships, he shared their dangers. As for those who say he was incompetent, he was this, he was that, you have to look at what tools he had to work with. When you've got tools you can rely upon, you look good. Even if you don't know what you're doing, if the tools function, all is well. If you've got shoddy tools to work with, human or otherwise, what are you going to do? But, as I say, in those places and times where everything was on him, he generally knew what needed to be done. The one criticism you might make of him is that he wasn't ruthless enough. That's a fair criticism that I've heard made. If only he'd been more ruthless. But you see, since then, we've had so many leaders who've been more than ruthless enough to make up for it all. I think of this old Czech lady in a restaurant when I was a teenager on Hollywood Boulevard in Hollywood, California. And I went in lovely old style restaurant, all sorts of tchotchkes, and a big painting of Franz Josef on the wall. And I said to the lady, "Ma'am, I thought you Czechs hated the Habsburgs." And she looks at me and she says, "Well, we did. But you know, we've had a number of alternatives since then, and none of them have really turned out very well." So you see, the best thing I can say about Karl is that the tragedy of Kaiser Karl and Kaiserin Zita, at the end of the day, wasn't theirs. It was ours. Because we have been left to be ruled by the kind of creatures that defeated them. Any other questions?
Yeah, we'll put out a final. Okay, Michael, you got your hand up again. We'll let you go, and then we'll put out a call for any final questions. Now we'll start to wrap things up. So if anybody has any final questions that they'd like to ask, this is now the time. So, Michael.
So I guess I was wondering about the relation between Canada and Blessed Charles of Austria. I know that St. Peter's and Paul Parish is the only shrine that we have of him in Canada, although there is a stained glass window of him in, I think, Kingston, or I think that either Queens or Ryerson at the Newman Center there. But why isn't there much of a huge devotion to Blessed Charles of Austria in Canada as opposed to our southern neighbor?
Well, I think there are several reasons for that. One of them has to do with, certainly for the church in Quebec, with the implosion since the Quiet Revolution, the Revolution Tranquille. Canada, you know, it's a country I love very much. As my dad always used to say, we were Canadian a lot longer than we've been American. And the problem, I think, is partially the fact that Kaiser Karl and his wife sum up in themselves the very qualities that the people who brought you the Revolution Tranquille have tried to get rid of at home.
Yeah.
You know, read Lionel Groulx, read George Grant. It's all there. I can tell you this much. If, as and when, a devotion to Kaiser Karl becomes more general in Canada, it will be a good gauge of the health of the Canadian church. I can tell you that. But as it stands, I mean, you know, they just took the crucifix out of the Parliament building and out of the Speaker's chair in Quebec City. You know, they're still on that. They haven't gotten the picture yet. They don't realize that the way they're steering the car is off the tracks. And until somebody somewhere figures that sufficiently, whether in church or state, it's going to be tough. The interesting thing, too, is that she being Empress Zita, as I mentioned, she spent the war years in Quebec, very close to Spencerwood, in Sillery, which was where, in those days, the lieutenant governor lived, in outside Quebec City. And you know, the funny thing, too, is that she and her children loved Quebec. Because you got to remember, this wasn't the Quebec of today. This was the Quebec of the 1940s. It was very, very Catholic. Very, how do I put this nicely? Sane. Sane. Fortunately, we've gotten past sanity.
Okay, we've got a question here from Mark. Do you think Archduke Rudolph's death might have also been connected to the same desire to turn Austria-Hungary into a federation? He had a vision in 1867 of a United States of Europe.
Well, he did. And as I say, there are a lot of, I mean, the Empress Zita always maintained it was murder. She was of the opinion that knowing that he was of a more liberal mindset than his father, certain foreign elements had attempted to sway them over to their side. But we know that in the month or so before he died, he had something of a reconciliation with his father. And so the question the whys and wherefores, as I say, it's like the Kennedy assassination of the 19th century. That's a whole lecture all its own, Meyerling. Very strange tale.
Okay, Michael's asking, what was the connection between Empress Zita and Salem?
Well, the connection was this. The Empress Zita's sister had become a nun at Solem. And then during the anti-clerical laws in the early 20th century, the nuns had to leave Solem and go to the Isle of Wight, to the Abbey of Coire, and she actually was schooled there for a couple of years. So that's something else about Zita I neglected to mention, that she actually lived in England for a little while. So they did move back eventually after World War I and the so-called Union Sacrée, when the French anti-clerical government realized they needed Catholic bodies and Catholic money to beat the Germans. They suddenly realized that a little more toleration for the church was probably a good idea. So she then became an oblate of Solem. And so that was her big ecclesiastical connection. And as a result, her cause was launched not in Austria, not in Switzerland where she died, but in the Diocese of Le Mans, where Solem is located.
Okay, well, it does look like we have run out of steam in the question tank, so I think I'll turn it back over to Michael for some closing words.
All right.
All right. So thank you very much, Mr. Coulombe, for giving us your time to talk about Blessed Charles of Austria and Empress Zita and their merits. It was a great talk, I must be honest, and it's great having you on. And I never would have thought of having you beforehand because of not COVID things, but there's one of the great things about COVID, allowed certain things to happen. So on behalf of the club, on behalf of all those attending, thank you very much. And right now, we are going to stay on, or me and Sam we will stay on for a bit for a social afterwards. And this is your time if you want to talk to us and socialize, or if you want to leave and do other stuff, then that's your choice as well. So here is the end of the talk. So everyone, please give a virtual or an actual round of applause for Mr. Coulombe.
Thanks very much.
And then I suppose, Charles, if you'd like to do a little plug, where would people be able to find you, or maybe things that you have produced over your excellent life? Where would they be able to go?
Find me. I've fled overseas. Oh, sorry. No. Well, several places. Every Monday I have a podcast, which is available on YouTube, Tumblar House, Tumblar, Tumblar House. I'm saying farewell to the Hungarian contingent. Tumblar House is the name of the YouTube channel, and it's the name of the show is Off the Menu. So you can see me every Monday holding forth on whatever the audience sends in for me to hold forth on, and you also see a selection of my essays and books on the Tumblar House. Tan Books is the publisher of both this book, the Catholic Quest for them. No, that just about does it.
All right. Well, once again, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love Vancouver. I love Canada, and what can I say? I don't know when I'll ever get back, but sooner or later I will. Father Horgan was there the last time I was there and took me to Chinese food. I haven't forgotten. So sooner or later. All right, well, gentlemen, with that, I'm going to excuse myself. It's a little late here, and I've got a few things I've got to do before I pass out.